I wouldn't be able to leave my work at work, and it would come home with me and it would have burdened me. My airline career, I can leave that at work. And so it's no longer, having to choose between being good at my job and being good at contributing to the company I was working with and stealing that time away from my family. It's a much better balance.
How many people go through life doing work they really don't like, but every day dreaming of, say, working in the aviation industry? They say it's too late. They think it would be too hard. They think it would go against conventional norms. If you never go after what you want, you'll never have it. This is Fly the Transition. Join us as we soar through the captivating stories of individuals embracing a thrilling journey into the aviation industry. From pilots spreading their wings to mechanics fine-tuning the engines and a myriad of industry professionals, each with a unique tale to tell. Get ready to dive into the diverse backgrounds, the pivotal moments that propelled their leap, and the sheer determination that transformed their aspirations into reality. We're not just about dreams. We're about making them take flight. Welcome to Fly the Transition. And now your host, Jim Schilling.
Welcome back, all my aviation friends, to another episode of Fly the Transition. On this episode, we welcome Major Airline pilot Aaron, who's going to talk to us about breaking out of his golden handcuffs to chase his dreams of aviation. So all that with Aaron in just a few minutes, but before we do that, I want to read a quick review from Apple Podcasts. This one from Gulls17, it says, the most inspiring aviation podcasts out there. We're all tired of the same old story. A teenager rushes through their ratings, builds time on the backs of others, and then bails for the airlines. Jim breaks down the monotony with his podcast, Fly the Transition. His interviews explore the unique and inspiring stories of people chasing their dreams later in life and finding a second career in aviation. A must-listen show for anyone considering a change in their life, whether aviation-related or otherwise. Take the leap, put in the hard work, and find ways to grow where you're planted. As the intro says, if you never go after what you want, you'll never have it. Thank you so much for that kind review. I always appreciate the feedback of those in our audience. I don't know that I deserve the praise of the most inspiring aviation podcasts out there, but I'll sure take it. It really means a lot to me when I get these reviews and be able to see the impact that I'm having on others. Truth be told, I just really enjoy these stories, and being able to tell them is pretty awesome. It's neat that people are able to trust me with their personal stories and adventures through their career into aviation and allow me to share that with you, our audience. So thank you once again for the review. If you're out there and you enjoy what I'm doing, please jump on wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. Please leave a rating and a review. It really helps to grow the podcast, get the word out there, and it really helps to fuel me as I continue to seek out and tell these stories. Speaking of seeking out and telling stories, let's talk a bit about Aaron, who we're going to talk to in this episode. Aaron had some really great early exposure to aviation through the Civil Air Patrol and would ultimately get his private pilot at a fairly young age. As he did so, he started to watch as the industry started to implode a little bit. This was the early 2000s, and the industry just wasn't what it is today. Aviation jobs were in fairly short supply, the pay wasn't nearly what it is today, and the route to go into the airlines through the military was more competitive. Aaron would end up starting his own business fixing computers and later end up consulting with business, finance, and technology to figure out how he could use technology to aid his clients in their businesses. As he consulted with these businesses, he used his hobby of aviation as a way to get around, to build hours, and continue building his ratings. He'd ultimately find himself in a situation where he was wearing the proverbial golden handcuffs, where it didn't make financial sense for him to leave what he was doing to chase his dream into aviation. But obviously that can't be the end of the story, otherwise he wouldn't be on this podcast. So let's jump into my interview with Aaron and see how he made his dreams become a reality. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Fly the Transition. I'm really happy to have you here to tell your story.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So I think we'll start off in a fairly obvious place. Where were you first exposed to aviation? Is this something that you grew up with or something you came along later in life?
Yeah, so it was something I got interested in as a young kid. I don't have any other pilots in my family. However, I just remember from a very, very young age, just being fascinated with airplanes. Jackson, Michigan, which had a small town airport there. And I remember on Saturdays, my dad would often take me to breakfast there. There was a restaurant there at this little airport, and I'd just be glued to the glass watching the airplanes come in, take off, and touch down, and just couldn't get enough of it. And so as I grew up, it was just kind of, my parents kind of fed that interest that I had. And, books and videos and magazines, you name it, they kind of fostered that interest that I had, and it never left as I grew up.
So as you're growing up and your parents are kind of building this for you a bit as they give you resources and materials, do you at some point in your earlier years work towards aviation ratings or anything like that, or does that come later too?
I was 14, maybe almost 15. And as it was evident, my interest in aviation was continuing. My father actually recommended that I join the Civil Air Patrol.
Okay.
So at a young age, I did that. And then, of course, with that program, for anybody who's familiar with the Civil Air Patrol, there's an opportunity to do orientation flights as part of that. So at 15 is when I got introduced to actually, doing some of my own flying, handling the controls. And again, I was more than hooked. So I actually ended up doing, through the Civil Air Patrol, I did a solo academy at 16, and I actually went on to continue on and got my private license at 17.
Oh, cool.
So it was very much at an early age, and went through and got the ratings.
Yeah, and we on this podcast have talked about Civil Air Patrol a little bit before, but just for those that need a refresher on the program, if you have kids or teenagers that are interested in aviation, it's a great program for exposure at an
I can't say enough good things about it. It's fantastic, and it was very impactful in my life. And honestly, some of the friends that I made in Civil Air Patrol at that age are still my lifelong friends today.
I had some time in the Civil Air Patrol too, so I get it. It is a great program. So can't say enough good things about the cadet side of things, and those orientation flights are a great opportunity for them to get an aircraft early on. So that's cool that you took advantage of that all the way through, the flight academies. So good for you.
Yes. Yeah.
So where do you go with aviation after that? Because I'm guessing you wouldn't be on this podcast if you went full on into an aviation career. Did you just fly for fun, or?
This is where it took a hard pivot. So as I mentioned that I got my private license at 17. It was true. I got my rating in July of 2001. September, 3 months later, 9/11 happens, and I watched the entire industry kind of implode, right? So I'm in high school, I'm in a senior, I'm trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up, and I'm watching the entire aviation industry just kind of implode on itself.
Yeah.
I was still pursuing it to a certain extent. I considered military. I was looking at that avenue. And of course, that wasn't a great avenue at that time, at least for me, as far as, who they were looking for and the selection process. And then what I was not sure I wanted to do when I grew up still, because I was like, well, do I want to just fly for fun and go do something else? So it was quite the interesting avenue, but I was looking at the industry going, this is terrible. No one's finding a job. But if you can find a job, you weren't making any money. Sure. It was a pretty rough time in aviation's history.
So as you get your rating in July and you're moving in towards, what we now know as 9/11, did you plan on going into aviation at that point, thinking, hey, I'm going to go be a pilot?
Yeah, my interest was, go military route and then go airline. That was kind of what I was thinking about. I wasn't fully committed to that because I did have a passion for technology. I had a passion for business as well. Sure. I enjoyed that aspect. So I kind of figured that was be a part of my life, but I wasn't sure that was going to be my career. I had intended that either military or airline professional pilot of some capacity was kind of in the future. But 9/11 really caused me to rethink that path. And so shortly thereafter, it was, okay, let me go into the business world, let me go into the technology industry, and I'll go that route initially and see what happens with the aviation industry.
Sure.
And so it took what ended up being, 12 to 14 years later before I ended up pursuing it.
Oh, okay.
There's more.
Probably more to that story
There's
here in a few
more
minutes.
twists and turns.
Well, let's start going down the road then. So you obviously don't go into aviation right out the gate. So you talk about going into business and technology. What path did you take to get to that direction?
Yeah, so after I graduated high school, and again, I was still somewhat pursuing the military. I went to a military institute for my freshman year of college. Again, the military situation wasn't the path I wanted to take, so I ended up again pivoting, and ended up taking a break from college and starting my own business, kind of a computer repair business. I knew a lot about computers. I had fixed them on the side for a while. And so I decided just to start my own business, fixing computers, to see what I could do with that. So that was, I'm an entrepreneur by heart. That's one of my passions. And so that was my first business. At the same time, I had moved. So I grew up, I mentioned that Jackson, Michigan is where I was as a young child, got my interest in aviation there. At age 11 to 21 or so, I was actually in Minnesota, and that's where I earned my ratings with the Civil Air Patrol as I lived there. Yeah, so I got my license up at St. Cloud is where I took my private check ride. But most of my flying and training was down at Flying Cloud Airport.
Sure.
I just happened to go up there for the check ride, but love the area. So as I was taking the break from college and I was still trying to figure out and start my own business, I had moved to the Chicago area to be near family who had relocated there previously. So I moved to the Chicago suburbs, and I was kind of getting my feet under me. I started this business, and it was doing pretty well. It was my first entrepreneurial venture, so of course it wasn't a fast start, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. So I had kind of resigned myself. This is, this would be 2004, 2005, even going into 2006. I kind of resigned myself that flying was a hobby. I had started doing some hobby glider flying. I hadn't, my business was not lucrative enough to afford me to go back and add my ratings at this time. Since I hadn't gone the military route and I didn't see a path in the professional aviation side at that time, I kind of was like, okay, well, let's just stick with the private. Let me go do some glider flying that's fun and inexpensive. So I went on in 2008. I added on my glider rating. So again, I kind of just decided this was going to be a really passionate hobby of mine, but I was having a lot of fun in the business technology world. I had joined in with a company as a consultant. I was doing full-time consulting in the technology space, the banking industry. I was getting more into the security side, the cybersecurity side even. Just having a lot of fun. And even though I had considered in the 2007 timeframe, when I saw the industry start to come back, I was like, okay, well, I could go spend the money. I could go get these ratings. And I could try to jump back into the professional pilot world. Oh, by the way, at the same time frame, I was getting engaged, and we got married in 2008. So there was a lot happening on the personal family
things
life.
going on.
So as I was kind of making that decision about what should I do, 2008 happened, right? And all of a sudden, everything imploded once again.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of, it literally was just cementing on me that, all right, this is just going to be a hobby of mine. I am, this is not a career that I'm meant for or is meant for me. But my passion for aviation never waned. I loved it. So
you go into business, you got this computer repair shop, and you're working into the technology field. And you talked a bit about working with finance and some cybersecurity. So what is the progression of your now chosen career path as far as how you've built your way from, being a small business owner into more involvement within the tech industry?
Yeah, it was one of those kind of stepping stone that it was, if you said, what's the fastest point between A and B to get into the, cybersecurity field? I took the opposite of that fastest route. It was really, I had this computer repair kind of company, And through that avenue, I had acquired enough customers or clients that I ended up meeting an owner of a consulting business. And he told me what he was doing, and I told him what I was doing. And he was like, well, would you like to come work with me? And, we'll bring your clients on under, I hadn't amassed enough where I was, my business was truly worth selling, if you will. Okay. So to me, it was more like, hey, if I join in with his company, I've got a bigger opportunity to serve the industry. I love doing things that I love to do, and I would head and have more resources to do the things that I didn't enjoy doing in the technology field. So I went that path. I was never, and I'm still not, I'm not the most technical guy. My passion in the technology field is to use technology, but to combine it with business. And so I was always on the operational side, the business development side, the strategic, what strategy can we do to build the business? What services can we create? What products can we develop? How does it serve the industry? And then communicate that into and kind of play the bridge between the technical people and the customer to do that. So that was always my sweet spot. And so as I joined in with this consulting company, again, I was able to exercise that side of my passion to really get into senior leadership within the company, get into relationship and business development side. And really have some fun with just building client experience and customer experience side of what ended up being primarily a focus on the small community banking industry. Okay. Was a big part of my career path.
So what were some of the things that drew you to that side of business and tech, the finance industry? Was it just the cybersecurity element of it, the finance, or was there a certain thing that drew you?
The consulting company that I joined in with, they had a lot of relationships with community banks. And so as I started working with them, one of the things that drew me into that side was I discovered that, they're under a great deal of regulatory compliance scrutiny. But these are bankers, right? And so what was happening, and I noticed this, and it happens in other industries too, but it's exacerbated on any industry that's highly regulated, and healthcare can play along in the same space. It was just not as big of a focus at the time. So these bankers, they're under this regulatory compliance aspect from the government or different regulatory bodies with these audits and exams. And there's, they're typical, their IT people, their directors, or even these outsourced companies, they come in there with the technical jargon and be like, well, we can do this, well, we can do this. Yeah. And what a lot of them were missing was to say, okay, what's the bank trying to do, from a business standpoint? Because banks are still businesses that have to operate, they have to be profitable, and they have to grow, and that's typically their mindset. How do you balance that? Combine it in with somebody who is knowledgeable of the regulatory compliance issues they've got, and then how technology can actually factor into that from a standpoint of helping them achieve those goals while staying compliant. That triad was very often missing. And so it was an aspect for me that I saw was an element that I could step into that role for my clients and really focus on saying, okay, let me understand what you want to do as a business, as a bank. Here's the regulatory issues that you're facing. That. Here's where we can leverage technology. Here's what we have to do to comply with regulatory. But here's an element, if we do it this way, not only can we comply with the regulatory issues over here, but we can actually, further your goals down the business element that allows you to do some of these other strategic things you wanted to do. And so that was kind of the role that I started to fill and really enjoyed that aspect of it when it came into the business world.
Did you have any experiences while you're doing that you found to be, specifically rewarding?
I'm a big relationship guy. I loved building relationships, with the clients, building the trust, kind of walking alongside of them. That was probably the most rewarding, and still is the most rewarding aspect of any job I've had is that ability to craft those relationships, nurture them, understand them, build a trusted relationship where they look to me as a resource that can help them, get to where they're trying to go. So.
And if I understand correctly, in our chats before we recorded and your bio, it sounds like you've had some pretty good success with your ventures in this arena.
Yeah, I've had some good successes and I've had some not so successful adventures, but they've been adventures nonetheless.
Yeah. So what are some of the challenges that you face in that career?
One of the biggest challenges, which anybody in the business or technology or pretty much in the industry can attest to, is I couldn't leave it at work.
Yeah.
There was no separation. What I would end up working 40, 50 plus hours in a work week. But then even when I was home, right, I was answering emails. I was dealing with, technology. We do updates and upgrades at night. So if something happened with those, we've got critical issues that have to be resolved by 7 a.m. when the bank reopens. So for me, it was, I spent several late evenings, texting with the technical team doing the upgrades going, hey, we had an issue with this, this server or something like that, what avenue do we have? And so, okay, well, let's do this. And so there's just a lot of that. There was a lot of nights and weekends, and there, even when I wasn't, doing those types of things, being in the business development space, we're often thinking of, okay, what should I be doing? What could we be doing? How do we grow? What product should we focus on? So it was mentally consuming as well. So the biggest challenge I had was based on my personality type, type A, those types of things. It was very hard to separate and be like, okay, I'm at home. So it took its toll on my marriage, my family, kids, and my health in general. Just being task saturated, if you will.
Yeah, I can understand that. So you may not have the most conventional path into a transition into a career in aviation. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it was not exactly the most, again, quickest point, A to B. Nope, didn't take that path.
It seems like you enjoy that, going the opposite of what the mainstream is.
Or maybe I just like making things harder than they should be, but
either or,
we'll see. Yeah, so what happened was, fast forward, so one thing that's important to note with my career in consulting, and one of the things that afforded me was over the next several years doing this, I had the opportunity to actually fly to business meetings. I call them relationship tours. So I would rent an airplane, and I would go around mostly the Midwest, and I would hit different small airports, and I would go visit clients, prospects, partners, you name it, and just had a blast doing that. So over the next several years, I added on, as I could afford it and find the time, I actually added on several more ratings. I added on my instrument rating, added on my multi-engine, my commercial single engine, my commercial multi-engine, and I actually went and got my flight instructor glider was my initial rating. And then I added on this the flight instructor airplane as well. So this, having those adventures and flying and having the opportunity to fly for business as kind of a part of it, but not the main part, I just, again, grew the passion for that side even more. Again, fast forward a little bit here, all the way up to about 2015. 2015 rolls around, and what's happening in the industry, in the aviation industry, is things are recovering from 2008. They're well on their way to recovery. And I think it was about 2015, there were some articles published, and I think one of them was the Boeing future forecast, where they kind of started projecting this mythical pilot shortage that they said was kind of in the future, but they projected it was coming. And so as things were starting to look better in the aviation industry, and I was at a company for going on 9 or 10 years, this consulting company. And I kind of felt like my time, the value I had added to that company had been realized. And I was kind of ready for a change. So I remember coming home one day, and my wife, she could kind of tell I was I was ready to move on. And she's like, well, if you left, what would you do? And I said, I really don't know. I'd really like to fly more. And she's like, well, what would that look like? And I go, well, I don't know. And she's like, well, would we be able to pay our bills? And I said, well, probably not. And so, but amazingly, she supported any idea that popped in my brain at the time. So this is where it gets interesting again with, so to ensure that I could still pay my bills and stuff like this. So at this point, just to recap, I've decided that I need to make a change, but I'm making good money in the business and tech industry. And even though the projection for the aviation industry was getting better at this point in time, I mean, you still starting salaries, if you could, $30,000-$40,000 a year with a guy like me with barely any hours. So I knew that it was going to be a difficult path. So what I ended up doing was I left the company I was with full time, but at the same time I did that, I started working nights and weekends as a flight instructor, mostly instructing in Cirrus aircraft. And the Cirrus aircraft, the SR-22, I was very familiar with it because it was predominantly what I rented when I was going on these business meetings. I was very familiar with the aircraft. So it was a natural choice for me to say, okay, I'm going to start instructing in that aircraft. And at the same time I was doing that, the rental company that I was working with, they were launching a sister company to do some on-demand charters, Part 135.
Okay.
And so as I got to know the owner, I asked and said, hey, if you ever need a pilot, let me know. I'm, transitioning out of the full-time, business and tech industry, and I'm interested in pursuing, professional aviation. So through some conversations there, he said, well, we've got this opportunity as a right seat in a Citation Ultra. In addition to the flight instructing, is that something that you're interested in? It doesn't pay very well because it's on demand. So you only get paid if you get called to fly. But for me, I was like, hey, it's a jet. It's an opportunity. I'll take it. So I started doing that. That was in 2016. As I was leaving the full-time industry, I had made enough connections in the business world so that I wanted to, that I felt I could kind of capitalize on in a good way, go and ask them to say, hey, I have this passion, just be upfront about it. I have this passion to pursue aviation. I have this experience. I'm willing to give you that experience for your company part-time, as long as it's flexible enough to allow me to accommodate a flight schedule. But I'll give you, X amount of days per week of my time. I'll give you this expertise, and I'll take a fractional salary, if you will, to do that. And so I actually ended up working with another cybersecurity company out of Ohio. They were a startup company. And then it started the series of a couple of consulting kind of interim roles, if you will, over the next couple of years, all of which, between the flying income that I was managing to scrape together between flight instructing, on-demand charter, I ended up flying skydivers for a little bit.
Sure.
Like anything I could do to build some hours. So by the time I decided I wanted to make this change, I was about 800 hours of total time. And of course, I had to get to the 1,500 to even, try to have a chance at the airlines. So I knew I had, several hundred hours in front of me to try to get there. I did that for the next about 2 years of time is how much it took me to get from the 800 total time to 1,500. And I actually continued to do that up until, but realistically, I did that almost till just over a year ago, while ensuring that they knew that my focus and my schedule priority was flying.
So that begs a question for me. I assume that you had some success doing this, obviously, because after a couple of years, you're able to start making a full transition. But did you find that companies were either all about helping you out and bringing you on part-time, or just completely turned off by the idea?
Yes. A lot of them were completely like, well, we really want somebody full-time. And that's why it ended up being, sometimes just these interim roles. I said, look, I'll come on for a defined period of time. I'll come on for, 12 months or something like that. I will accomplish, X and Y. And, then I'll move on because you really want to replace that role with somebody full time. And I'll come in and I'll establish it, if you will. I'll build it. I'll define it. I'll get it greased. And then you can hire somebody else to, hand it over to as these companies were trying to grow. So that ended up being what I did for a few different startup companies. And there was never any, bad blood or animosity. It was not like because the expectations were set up front. And that's why, for me, if someone is looking at, if they're looking at making this change, but they're looking at it going, look, I make six figures or I make a really good income and I don't want to take this massive pay cut to go, make, $30,000 or $40,000 a year as a flight instructor right now. I just can't afford that with my lifestyle. This is a path. It's unconventional, but having that upfront conversation with these business owners, especially in today's day and age post-COVID, this was pre-COVID that these conversations were happening, but now, sure, I think it's even more prevalent and more possible. People are used to working remotely and saying, look, I don't care where you are. I would work on overnights when I was on a 3-day trip for my flying gig, whatever time I had at the hotel, that was email time. That was on my computer getting stuff done for the business and technology roles that I was still playing. And that's extremely, extremely doable in the airline and professional pilot world. We have a lot of downtime. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I sat in FBOs, waiting on passengers to come back, and I'm there for 4 or 5 hours waiting on them. Well, my laptop's open the entire time working away, and then it's like, okay, they're on their way. I'm like, okay, put that down, put the different hat on, go out and get the airplane ready to go.
So with your past role, and one of the things that sounds like started to drive you towards the career in aviation is you're kind of always connected to work. And I got to imagine with this approach and maybe I'm wrong, but I'd imagine with this approach that not only are you working the flying side and flight instructing, but having these other part-time gigs, did you find that to be taxing, or was it still kind of manageable?
That's an excellent question, because here's where, yes, from an hour standpoint, it was probably very, very similar hours-wise. But here was the big difference that I experienced that made the difference for me and why this was sustainable, if you will, was in my previous, when you're full-time, I had, a lot of roles with small companies where we wear a lot of hats. And so it was not being able to shed those when I got home and switching hats. When I took these part-time roles, I didn't have all those hats. I was coming in to fulfill a role, and maybe that role had 2 or 3 hats because it was still a small company. But it wasn't maybe the 6 or 7 hats I was wearing when I was full-time in leadership roles at these other companies, where it would really truly consume all my hours and all my mental, capability. So yes, I was still working kind of the same amount of hours, but the mental load was a whole lot less because my piece of the pie was a whole lot smaller as I was taking these part-time roles, if you will.
So we talked a bit about pay too, and I think that there's likely listeners out there who are struggling with that concept that you mentioned of, you're making 6 figures and now can I afford to make the sacrifice and chase a dream in aviation? So I know you talked a little bit about, obviously the part-time consulting work was probably pretty helpful for that, but were there any sacrifices that you had to make as a part of making that transition from maybe a higher paid job to aviation?
Yeah, there was a pay cut. I limited the pay cut by doing the approach that I took. And it definitely was extremely helpful. But there's no question, if someone is interested in making this, career jump, when everything in the aviation industry is, especially at the airlines, is predominantly, seniority based. And so you are usually starting over at the very bottom. Doesn't matter what experience you have. You're starting over the very bottom. In my case, I was a low-time pilot in addition to that. And so not only did I not have the seniority number, I also didn't have a lot of experience or hours. And so it was very much, I was at the bottom end of pay scales when it came to the aviation side. So yes, there's no question that there's sacrifices to be made. There is tightening of the belt and the budget side, but I was able to limit that reduction by the approach that I took, which it allowed out. We cut out the frills, we cut out the expensive restaurant stuff, but we didn't cut out any basic needs. It didn't come where we were like, no, we can't afford that, or I'm not sure how we're going to pay our mortgage this month. It never came to those types of issues because of this approach of saying, hey, I'm going to be upfront. I'm still going to work in the consulting world, and it's going to pay enough to make sure that doesn't happen.
You also mentioned earlier that your wife is part of the decision process and you guys talk through things. How important is the support structure at home to making a change like this?
Oh, it's absolutely essential. It's absolutely critical. If she had, been against it or downplayed it or something like that, anything other than fully supportive, it would have absolutely been insurmountable from a challenge perspective. It's the fact that my wife was just like, sure, let's go tackle this. I can't imagine being able to do what I did without that support at home. Of course, I had to do some selling to her in the sense of, how much of a pay cut are we actually going to take?
Yeah.
But then there was that trust that, I will go get these part-time consulting roles. We'll get an income that we can survive off of, even if it's tightening the belt a little bit, and we'll make it happen because this is a passion that was worth pursuing. And that was what I had to convey to my wife. It wasn't something like, hey, I feel like I want to go try this on a Saturday, and by Monday it's out of my system. This had been something that, I was truly passionate about since a young kid, and it was only growing as I was able to exercise it with the relationship tours I was doing in the business side. It was only growing. And so she knew that this was not some kind of a thing I needed to get out of my system and go try and then say, okay, that's fine, I'm going to go back to the business world. She knew it was serious.
So you're tightening things down a little bit as far as budgets are going, and you're working your way through these part-time gigs and building your hours up. What comes next?
So as I'm doing the on-demand Part 135 and the citation, I'm also flying some skydivers. The magic number hits. I hit 1,500 hours, and at 1,500 hours, slightly before then, I put my app in at the regional airlines, and so in July of 2017, I get a class date out at SkyWest Airlines, and I head out to do my initial training in July of 2017. So to me, this is a major thing because this is my first full-time role in the airline industry. I had flight instructed, and I had been an on-demand Part 135, and I had flown jumpers. Those are all contract roles, part-time, very part-time. This was my first actual full-time role as a professional pilot, but it still didn't pay very well. But it was at least a step in the right direction. Again, stepping stones to do it. And so in July of 17, I went to training, and I started again at the bottom, and at least I had a regular paycheck, and I was building hours faster. And I was flying, I flew the Embraer 175. It's a great airplane. I had a whole lot of fun doing that. And I continued on from that, still working in the business and technology and cybersecurity, still working with the startup companies. And I was still having a lot of fun with there. And it afforded me a better schedule, a more predictable schedule to say, here's the days I have off. And so it worked even better as I started with the airlines. And again, between the starting salary, I think at SkyWest at the time, starting pay was like $36 or $37 an hour, which equated to less than $40,000 a year as a first-year FO at a regional. And so, again, having that consulting role helped bridge that gap so that, my family, we, again, didn't have to take so much of a pay cut to make this a reality.
That sounds like that was a really nice safety net to have as well to help you through any of those challenging times as you're training. I know that a lot of the people I've talked to say, like, well, it's nice to know that at least I could fall back on this if this doesn't pan out.
Correct. And honestly, that's to this day and age. We don't know. Right now, there's a pilot shortage, but who knows what the future holds. And a perfect example is COVID, right? When COVID was happening and the airlines weren't sure if what was happening from furlough's perspective, that wasn't a massive concern of mine. There was concerns about health. There was concerns about how this affects our economy and other things, but it wasn't necessarily a massive concern of mine of being furloughed and what am I going to do? Because to me, I was still working in the business world. Yeah. And so that was my safety net. I was like, well, if I take a furlough, I'll just ramp up my hours in the business world to cover part-time for that. And then when flying returns, go back to what I was doing. So it's a great safety net from that perspective as well.
So when COVID hits, are you still at the regionals at that point?
I am. So I'm at SkyWest until last year. I wasn't sure, my goal was to become a professional pilot. I checked that box. My goal was to get to the airlines, and be an official, jet pilot for the airlines. That was that childhood dream I had that I finally fulfilled. So I wasn't unhappy. I wanted to enjoy every step of the journey I had. But, it's always a goal when you're a pilot, well, I'd like to get to a major. But I was not in a big hurry. I was at SkyWest until late last year. So just over 5.5 years at SkyWest, and enjoyed every minute. So yes, I was fully at the regionals right through COVID, all the way through, and the ups and downs of that. And, walking through the terminals with, seeing one or two passengers, flying empty airplanes, flying airplanes with one or two passengers on it. It was, again, another scary time in the aviation's history.
I'm always curious about this part. As you're making those flights with one or two passengers, or are you flying even any empty legs where it's just you and the crew?
Yes, we did that a lot.
And what was that like for you? Like, what, I know you mentioned scary, but what other thoughts are you guys having, or discussions that you're having in reference to the operations you're carrying out?
The biggest question is how long is this sustainable? Because, to a certain extent, we were operating a much pared down schedule, but we were still operating a ton of flights, from a daily perspective. And they were all either empty or a handful of passengers. And it's like, okay, this is not sustainable. At what point does that, shut down, or where we go, look, until X point, we cannot continue to do this. So it was really that question of how far does this go, and who's paying for all this? Because the government hadn't stepped in yet. This was still before that happened. And I'm like, SkyWest is a good company, was very financially strong, but at what point do they say we can't justify this expense anymore to fly empty airplanes around just to keep our network intact?
Right. Such a crazy time just in the country as a whole. And it's always interesting to hear how it impacts individuals too.
Yeah.
So appreciate you sharing that part of it.
Absolutely.
So as you're working your way through the regional, and you still have your hands in the tech industry, did you find that there are certain skills that you acquired in the tech and consulting games that were really helpful for you in aviation? Yeah,
I would say the biggest thing that was helpful that crossed over was, and it still is a general understanding of how computer systems work. Computer systems are computer systems are computer systems. They are designed to perform a function, and they follow a very set of logic. And so if it's a server at a bank or any other organization, that server is programmed a certain way to function. And when it malfunctions, or how it's programmed, or how you interact with that server is defined, right? And it kind of follows this programming logic. You step into technically advanced aircraft and, flight computers and VNAV computers and all this different stuff that we interact with in these jet aircraft, airliners, you name it. And it was a very easy transition as I went to bigger and more sophisticated aircraft, learning the technology, the systems, the how they acted, the flight computers, the thought process, when the autopilot, when it would malfunction, what it was doing, how it worked, what the logic was. It was actually a very easy transition from that standpoint, because I had a general understanding of computers and computer logic, and it still benefits to this day as I'm flying bigger and more advanced aircraft. It was one of the biggest benefits in that previous career.
Another thing I picked up on when you were talking earlier is it seemed like you had to do a lot of big picture problem solving type of situations in your consulting and business world. Do you find that to be helpful as well? The being able to problem solve the way that you did within business, is that transferable as well?
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially as a captain, I was a captain for about a year and a half at the regionals, and big picture, making decisions, seeing the end result, the mission, but not compromising safety. Those are a lot of different things that in the business world were kind of every day. It's like, hey, we want to accomplish this goal as an organization, but here are the things that we need to consider to do that. And so that thought process, the decision-making process that's very prevalent in business, crosses right over to making decisions in the cockpit. Those interpersonal relationships, that were developed in business, they cross right over. How do you interact with the captain? How do you interact with the first officer? How do you make decisions as a crew? How do you use language that does not put the other pilot in a position where they have to agree or disagree, but puts them in the position where they can actually contribute their individual thoughts as an experienced crew member to ensure that, hey, we're going to accomplish the mission as much as we can, but we're never going to compromise safety to do it. So therefore, any ideas, throw them out here as we're, even the smallest thing is of, which way are we going to go around a thunderstorm? If you use the right language, you can get some really good ideas and make sure that the other crew member is on the same page with you. And that all comes directly crossover from a lot of things in business.
Yeah, I got to imagine it's a leadership, it's problem solving, all of that stuff that makes their way into the flight deck as well. Before we get back to this interview, a quick word from those who make the Fly the Transition podcast possible. Aviation friends, are you looking for eyewear that's as adventurous as you are? Look no further than Flying Eyes Optics. Their ultralight, comfortable, and durable glasses and sunglasses are perfect for pilots. They are designed by pilots, for pilots, and for my money, they're the best aviation eyewear that I have ever had. If you or that special pilot in your life are interested in Flying Eyes, check out our affiliate link down in the show notes and use code FlyingMidwest10 and you can get 10% off your next purchase at Flying Eyes. Are you ready to gear up for your summer adventures? We'll dive into the skies with Pilot Quarters, your go-to destination for stylish aviation apparel. From breezy camp shirts to vibrant sporty polo shirts, Pilot Quarters has everything you need to get ready for summer. So head on over to pilotquarters.com today and soar in style.
You're listening to Fly the Transition. If you've ever thought about changing careers and getting into the aviation industry, welcome to your new home. Now, back to your host, Jim Schilling.
So as you go from the regional airlines to the majors, what does that process look like for you? I know that you've mentioned that, that's the direction you want to go. You eventually want to get to the majors. Is there a certain decision point where you're like, now's the time? Did it just come to you, or how did that work for you?
For me, it was very much the personal family situation. It had to be the right time to move on. It had to be I didn't want to commute, so it needed to be a local airline that had I'm still in the Chicago area with my family. So I wanted to be a Chicago major with a domicile there. And so it also had to be, we had, I've got 3 kids now. My youngest is just over 3 years old. So for the past couple of years, it wasn't the right time to try to move on from the regionals and get to the majors. So it really was a lot of, again, my wife had sacrificed a lot to allow me to pursue this career. I wasn't going to be overzealous to move on as quickly as I could and sacrifice my family once again to try to make this happen before, kind of the timing was right. So last fall is, as my wife and I are discussing what's coming next, my youngest was going to be 2. We had some different family events planned for later that fall. But then we were looking behind it and going, well, if you were going to make a move to a major, in the next couple of months is probably as good as time as any, because, for those who have experienced initial training at any airline is basically 2 months of time. So again, committing to that, where does that fit into the family schedule? It was very difficult. So last fall is when I made that decision. So fall of 22, and started putting out the applications. Luckily, it did not take extremely long. The pilot shortage was, starting to ramp up at the majors, and I got the call and interviewed and started training. I was the first class in January of 23, and so I had fulfilled the family obligations, and it was a perfect timing to spend 2 months in training at the major airline, and again, the culmination of kind of this unconventional path. And what I failed to mention too is up until the spring of 22, I was very much still working in the technology, cybersecurity space part-time. What ended up happening there is, at the same time that I had been working those different consulting businesses, my wife, who was a registered nurse at a local hospital for 16 and a half, almost 17 years, she decided that it was time for her to be done at the hospital. And she had started just a home-based business as a sewing designer, making and designing patterns related to and sewing tutorials for bags, wallets, purses, backpacks, you name it. Huh. And that business, so I had been helping her on the side because, again, I'm a serial entrepreneur junkie. And so this was just something, a passion of mine. So I was always helping her on the side, but I was then very busy on the either flying or on the cybersecurity side. As her business grew, it was evident to me that really where the future of this path was, again, still allowing me to explore both of my passions, was to say, I am going to be an airline pilot and exploring that passion of mine. But the other side is I was going to be running this business with my wife. And so I had another conversation with the ownership of the startup company, and I said, hey, this is where I'm at. I need to step away. And they were very gracious and understanding and supportive of that. And so I stepped away from all operational roles in the cybersecurity and tech industry. And now what it looks like today is I fly my schedule. I'm home with my kids. And if I'm working on business adventures, it's with my wife, and it's fantastic. That's so cool. It's a very unconventional path to get here. Yeah. That's my, if someone is listening and going, I'm struggling with this and I want to make this move and it's a passion of mine as well, like, I almost guarantee you there is a path to do it. And sometimes it requires to think outside the box, to get a little creative. It does require maybe some sacrifice for a period of time. But, to me, I'm sitting here going, I'm running a business with my wife that's being very successful, and I'm at the major airline of my choice. And it's a great spot to be in, and I get to truly explore both passions of mine with a very supportive spouse.
What do you find to be the most rewarding part of where you're at now?
What's the most rewarding for me, obviously, besides flying big, shiny new jets, is a lot of fun. The other one is that before, I wouldn't be able to leave my work at work, and it would come home with me and it would burden me. And that anything I was working on in my business at home was taking away from my family, was taking away from my marriage. What this environment, and I'm not saying everybody needs to go start a business with their spouse, but what I have been able to finally get to a point with is that, my airline career, I can leave that at work. I don't bring that home with me. And then when I am at home working on work stuff, it's viewed as an investment into my wife. It's viewed as an investment into my family. And so it's no longer this battle between, having to choose between being good at my job and being good at and contributing to the company I was working with and stealing that time away from my family. It's a much better balance and investment into the marriage and the family accordingly.
So what advice would you give to others who would be considering a change into a career in aviation?
If it's a passion of yours, find a way to make it happen. Map it out. Talk to your spouse, get them on your side, or determine that they're not on your side, and then factor that in. Most often, it may take some selling, like it did with my wife, but chances are they're going to be supportive. There is a path to get there, no matter if the airline's your choice or not. I have another close friend that was in another career as well, came to me and asked for advice on making the jump. He's not sure that he wants to get to the airlines. He'd be comfortable getting to a Part 91 corporate job or even a Part 135. There's so many different aspects, but I guarantee you, if this is a passion of yours and you're willing to think outside the box and you're willing to put in the work to be creative in how you get there and accept an unconventional path, it can be done. And I would advise you just get out and make it happen.
Awesome. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me so far is we talk about like the financial aspect of it and the golden handcuff, so to speak, of you're kind of stuck there for financial reasons. But I think it's really inspiring to see that you found a way to, through that maybe more unconventional path, you found a way to still make ends meet and make your dreams a reality. So very cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
I cannot thank you enough for coming on and sharing your story. I really appreciate it. And I wish you all the best of luck with your new major airline.
My pleasure. And thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you once again to Aaron for joining me on this episode of Fly the Transition. What resonated for me with Aaron in this episode was that he recognized this golden handcuff situation, but at the same time, he's still building his ratings and he's taking his hobby and his passion for aviation and continuing to grow and foster that with where he's at. And ultimately down the road, he's able to take those opportunities and capitalize on them with how he goes about his journey into the airlines. So really cool story. I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Aaron, and I wish you nothing but the best as you continue your progression through your major airlines. Coming up on our next episode, I'm going to talk with Jason Reynolds. He is a former lead pastor at church as well as works in real estate, and he is currently in the middle of his journey to a professional aviation career as he still works in real estate, but he is also a freelance CFI as he continues to build up those hours to ultimately achieve his dream of commercial aviation. So another one of those episodes where we talk to someone who's still kind of mid-transition here and hear where they're at, what their story is, and hopefully inspire some others along the way. As we wrap up here, if you are interested in being a guest or know someone who is, reach out to me on any of my social medias, or you can email me, flythetransition@gmail.com. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Fly the Transition, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Fly the Transition. Life is too short for you not to do what you love. And our passion is to give you all the tools you need to make the transition from doing what you do to being in the aviation industry. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, you can reach out by email at flythetransition@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook at Fly the Transition. And the website for Flying Midwest Media is flyingmidwest.com. Keep soaring. See you next time on Fly the Transition.